Welcome to my thoughts on the National Park Service and the year 2025. It looks like we are going to return to the fight over whether the National Park Service should retain stewardship of our national lands, and in the process, the doctrine of highest and best use is going to be trotted out. So, as our tour of the national park lands looks specifically at land that has been preserved in its more or less wild form, as the rest was divided, cultivated, and put under individual ownership, I think it's worth spending a moment with this idea. The highest and best use doctrine, when determining the proper disposal of a piece of land, repeatedly comes down to, is this land directly making money for someone? Over the decades, there has been some recognition that sometimes there are places that the immediate monetary value of a place might be overridden by some bigger picture concerns. For example, the area around rivers and streams. Maybe it should be stabilized and have reduced pollution. Or that unstable hillsides should be left with their natural vegetation so they don't tumble down, destroying the land above and crushing the living things beneath it. But at other times, leaving a piece of ground as it is, with the invisible things underneath left as they are, and the benefits it offers to humans and non-humans alike in the spaces above, can be a little harder to argue. And so, there is going to be much fighting about whether there is a benefit to land being just left and maintained the way it is, and whether or not national land should be managed by the nation. Instead, it will be argued it should become the responsibility of localities that are not budgeted or equipped to do so they can be more easily sold off to private citizens. Well, I'm team national lands belong to the nation and benefit from being part of a national network that works together. This week's National Historic Monument, which exemplifies this past and near future fight, is the Tall Grass Prairie National Preserve and Monument in Strong City, Kansas, located just off the diagonal section of Interstate 35 that connects Wichita and Topeka, which means it's pretty much in the middle of the eastern half of the state, and its remoteness from anywhere in particular is partly why this 11,000-acre remnant of the 170 million acres of tall grass prairie that used to carpet the center of the country still remains. The earliest European Americans who came to tame, conquer, and colonize this portion of the continent saw it as a barren, treeless waste inhabited by savages. As a result, it really only had one plausible future if it were to be incorporated into the America that surrounded it. It would need to be sectioned off into farms, or it would remain simply a useless desert. The prairie started to go under the European plow in the early 1800s, and with the commercial production of the steel plow starting in the 1830s, the majority of the prairie grass would be overturned in 50 years before the end of the century. And right around then, when the tough skin of this grassland had been cut open just about everywhere, the disasters of the early 1900s would begin to come home to roost. So now that we have stopped to look closely, the tall grass prairie is a complex and rich place, as complex as any patch of forest. But instead of towering trees, the plants are all entangled grasses. The most obvious sign of this is the wave after wave of flowering plants that happen throughout the growing season, beginning with spiderwort, indigo and larkspur in the spring, butterfly milkweed, snow on the mountain, and coneflower in the summer, and then wrapping things up with the wild sunflowers in September. The roots underneath make a tangled trap for carbon and organic material of a richness almost unimaginable to the modern farmer, but they also create a water-holding mat that made the grand aquifers that have watered our country for the last 100 years, and we are sucking dry. The Tall Grass Prairie National Preserve is one of the 6 large prairie preserves where we are finally delving into what made the center of the North American continent a place that supported those unimaginably large herds of bison, along with other large mammals like elk, antelope, pronghorn, their predators, and incredibly diverse bird, bat, and insect populations. What was once seen as an impossibly desolate sea of endless grass turns out to have stored up riches, visible and unseen, that the U.S. would come to depend on. So to see what this deceptively complex landscape looked like, dive into the center of the country to see the Tall Grass Prairie National Preserve near Strong City, Kansas, just off the Santa Fe Historic Trail. And even though this preserve is certainly closer to some people, it tells part of the story that belongs to the whole nation. And that's the mission of the national parks, to make the land a library of our past so we can all access it and learn what it has to say. Episode 136. America is made of bread and steel. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at how the middle of the continent was made valuable. At the very start of the century, travel by any method other than water was a hardship. But a few pieces of technology are going to come together in ways that would change the Great Plains of the North American continent from the Great American Desert to the breadbasket, and travel to, through, and across it over land would become the way of the future. To find out what some of the essential pieces of this transformation were, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that without steel, American agriculture, and as a result, global agriculture, could never have advanced to where it is today. If there's one thing writing this podcast has taught me, it's that American food and modern technology are bound together more tightly than in any other part of the world. And it is the pivot point of steel and wheat that truly set America on its way to the modern age. In our daily life, most of the interaction of food and steel we consider has to do with the food preservation and life extension, the food manufacturing complex, the tin and other coated steel and canned goods industry. And then there's the steel that holds together the great refrigeration complex of the American and global perishable food supply. See Nicola Twilley's book, Frostbite, for more on that. But for all of this to come about, for all of it to get started, the steel plow had to come into being. If you've been listening along since somewhere around season 1, you'll know before we can get going on our present, the first part of the 19th century, this is one of those times where I have to go backwards to go forwards. It's time for another dive backwards into history. If you'd like even more detailed background on America's relationship with iron and the plow, skip back to episode 20 in season 1. But right here, I'll just hit the highlights and get us to the technology history that needs to really get sorted out for this episode. And of course, before we can even get to technology, we get to take our first pointed look into geology. That's right, we've done biology, biochemistry, chemistry, and even some metallurgy. More of that to come this episode. But this is our first specific need for the particular science of geology. Because in the center of the country, the soil is different. Way back at the beginning of the colonization efforts on the American shores, once people who knew how to farm were farming, they did it pretty well. The farming techniques of at least how to plant a farm worked because the geology and drainage of Western Europe and the eastern side of the eventually to be United States are close enough to the same that what worked on one side worked pretty well on the other. I mean, these two pieces of land used to touch long ago. They were about the same geological age and were both on a downslope into the sea, more or less. For the most part, these are sandy-ish soils that, when the trees are all taken off, if left to their own devices, will eventually slide into the rivers and into the sea. There are certainly exceptions, but the way the fate of the Chesapeake Bay shows that the soil of the land, when given a chance, will slide off into the sea. After all, when the land was heavily wooded with hardwood forest, the Chesapeake Bay was a deeper water bay. There are paintings showing sailboats bobbing at the shoreline, tied up to the trees that came down to the beach. Today, the Chesapeake is a shallow, silted-up body of water with long, shallow beaches, and it needs to be dredged to allow cargo to get to the ports. The geology shows that when the land around the bay was denuded of trees and then plowed up for tobacco, all the soil and quite a bit of the dirt in the subsoil washed into the streams and into the rivers and then into the sea. As the century progressed and all the flattest, best land was taken up, people progressed west and then further west. And for most people, that meant uphill into the Appalachians. But if there's one thing that has been true the world over for as long as people have been setting up farms, no one farms in the mountains unless they pretty much have to. And the people colonizing, settling in, and settling down in this new America looked around and saw that they could fight the mountains and farm there, and a few did. But most saw that with a long walk to the Great Lakes area or a very long walk to the Oregon Territory, they could get some new flat land to farm. It was during some of those earliest trips out to the Oregon Territory, and then out to the gold fields of California and on trading trips down to the quasi-Spanish Empire along the Santa Fe Trail, that the Great Plains earned the name of the Great American Desert. The people in charge of naming the country and making maps were all people who had grown up with the idea of trees and rolling hills representing home as the best places to be. Wide open expanses with no trees and an endless sky was seen as a desolation. Tens of millions of bison, antelope, deer, and elk, seemingly endless flocks of pigeons and other birds notwithstanding. But for the farming type, the people used to looking at lands as a place to grow food, find food, and build a home that will stay put, the grasslands spreading out from the shores of the Great Lakes and the impressive rivers of this middle area started to have appeal. You can only watch so many large, meaty ungulates wander by. You can only scare so many clutches of quail out of the grass and smell the tantalizingly toasted wheat smell of the grass on a warm fall afternoon to not start to wonder if this supposed desert might not be fertile land after all. And so, after the up and down of the Appalachians were left behind, a trickle and then a steady stream of people, soon to be called sodbusters, came to try their luck on these wide, treeless plains. Unlike the somewhat sandy soils of the outer slopes of North America, this interior bowl between mountain ranges had a different past. First, this had once been a wide, shallow ocean. Then over time, plants, settling mainly on grasses, forbs, and shrubs, had grown up. The succession of grazers had eaten, trampled, and then added organic matter back into this wide landscape. While, yes, eventually all of it folds into the Mississippi and rolls to the sea, this land is much flatter. The ways are much windier, and so organic muck, soil, all that good stuff builds up in there. Think of it as a bit like that puddle that forms in one part of the parking lot with the first rain of fall, and then with the tricks of drainage and uneven surfaces, it stays filled. The water running in and down, it's not quite all draining away and drying out until things warm up and finally evaporate sometime in late April. And then that corner of the parking lot has a thick layer of muck. All the rotted leaves, decayed paper, and bird contributions have decayed into this mat of rich organic material. And if this corner doesn't get swept out, it's going to grow a rather impressive mat of grass. Nature will be clawing back a corner of that parking lot. And it's notable that this fertile muck is sticky, just like the way the rich grass-growing prairie soil is rich and sticky. And it's held in place by impressively intertwined and thick mats of roots. More than one early prairie shack, lean-to, and dugout had a roof of bricks made of these thick root mats. The roots are tough and have some stretch, and they ramify out into small and smaller threads, making them a chore to cut through. Right, so sticky dirt and tough, bouncy roots. That's all that stands between you and your first crop of wheat in this rich, dark soil hiding under the tall grass prairie. But don't worry, that's what a plow is for. I mean, it transformed the eastern seaboard. Now it's time to tackle the grass. How hard could it be? I mean, there aren't even any trees to clear out of the way this time. Well, turns out hard, even very, very hard. While the 17th and some of the 18th century farmers were using harrows, that is, pins to scratch the dirt and cut through the weeds, or possibly a wooden plow, every late 18th century farmer who was doing well was absolutely using an iron plow. The iron and charcoal supplies of early America were well known. Wrought iron and cast iron were both well-established technologies. They were expensive and labor-intensive, but they were enough to supply the growing farmer population of young America. The supply of wheat that had grown up over the end of the 18th century meant mills dotted the landscape. Wheat bread was accessible to a large proportion of the population, and in bad war and weather years in Europe, some of that wheat crop was even exported over there. And the sugar islands imported a fair bit of grain, and the barley crops were plentiful for brewing beer. Of the two prominent styles of worked and shaped iron, cast iron was preferable for plows. It was harder, it wore longer, even if it was quite a bit more brittle than wrought iron. And in the sandy soils of the Atlantic slope, that worked quite well. But the rich, juicy, organic soils ridden with prairie roots stuck to those iron plows, and farmers had to stop every few feet to scrape off the metal. And that's no way to plow a field. If only there were a plow that was up to this new, clearly rich and robust soil that could cut through the roots and scour itself off and keep going. Well, there was a material that would do this. It was steel. But there wasn't much of it, especially in America. So what is steel as compared to cast and wrought iron, and what made it work better as a plow compared to cast iron? Okay, way back in episode 3, I brought up voyage iron and how in the 15th and the 16th century, different methods for making iron metals were divergent, and what was called iron, what was steel, and it was all messy. This is due to the fact that alchemy and chemistry were contemporary and in use at the same time, and that the iron and steel were being developed. And then there was the fact that the scientific method and standardized nomenclature were far off into the future. All of this led to some murkiness around what things are called. So for my own peace of mind, I had to iron it all out. First of all, there's the element iron. All on its own, iron is a soft silvery metal that's very ductile and flexible. But you rarely see it this way because it loves to combine with other things. Oxygen especially. I mean, oxygen is only the most common element on Earth. It doesn't seem like it, but if you remember, it's all bound up in things like oxides and silicates. That's where it really all is. Anyway, iron likes to combine with things, so getting pure iron is almost impossible, and actually not that desirable. But if you can combine iron with little bits of the correct stuff, it can become incredibly useful. And you can even grant it different properties by carefully controlling the recipes. And interestingly enough, by controlling the baking temperatures and the cooling methods as well. So back to our pre-thermometer ages, most people were making wrought iron, cast iron, and only a little bit of steel. Technically, these are all iron alloys. That is, they're mostly iron with a little other stuff in them, but ancient tradition gives them these names. And all of them start by separating as much iron as possible from the other stuff that's in iron ore by heating it up as hot as humanly possible. Now, how hot that is has changed over the centuries. But in each case, you are melting out iron and burning off the combustible stuff, forcing some of the impurities into the air, and the rest becomes slag. That is, hunks of rocky silicates that turn out to be useful as fill materials in different building contexts. But that's another show. Cast iron is the easiest to mass produce. It has the highest carbon content of the 3 types. And these carbon inclusions allow it to be hard, but it also makes it brittle. Under rapid large temperature changes and vibrational stress, cast iron will crack, and in some spectacular situations, shatter. But if you need something durable, like a stove or cookware, that only has to go from room temperature to fire hot and not suffer vibrational or pressure stress, it will serve you for years. Its higher inclusion of carbon, along with some phosphorus and sulfur impurities, means that it has a porous surface, and that is what allows the mud of the prairies to stick to it. Wrought iron is also made by heating iron ore to melt the pure iron out and the rest of the junk in there with it. But what makes it different from cast iron is that it is now pounded and beaten to burn off even more of the included impurities. The pounding and beating also allows some of the included impurities, that is, the slag, to be broken into tinier and tinier pieces and spread more evenly throughout the iron. This grants flexibility and rust resistance to the resulting alloy. It's great for shaping, and it tends to bend, not break, and it can take some vibrational stress. So all those fun wrought iron gates and railings are what they are because of these properties. Also because well-made wrought iron is incredibly resistant to rust. Another reason it was a popular decorative metal. It is far less porous than cast iron, but it's softer. If it were to be used for plows, it would wear down frustratingly fast as it was pushing through dirt, encountering rocks, and it would be, frankly, useless for cutting through roots. You'll notice how there's no one advertising wrought iron knives. I mean, they're not advertising cast iron ones either, but definitely no wrought iron. However, if you keep beating and folding wrought iron, that's how it becomes steel. You're exposing more and more of the surface, so it allows more and more of the impurities to be beaten out. And those impurities that remain, mainly carbon at this point, they're broken into even smaller and smaller inclusions. The larger pockets of carbon in the wrought iron and the cast iron create weak points, but very tiny inclusions actually makes the resulting alloy something that can flex and then bounce back. It can bend without breaking or creasing. And then procedures like quenching, that is, dropping the temperature rapidly by placing hot metal in a cool liquid, water or oil or some other esoteric mixtures, those do interesting crystal structured stress tricks that increase this bouncy property even further. Steel, in its 19th century form, is more brittle than wrought iron, but the way it can flex and recover is a trade-off. And in this barely mechanical age, there are actually few stresses that this sort of steel can't take. At this point in history, for people working with different kinds of iron and steel, the knowledge of what activity is doing what is still a little murky. The best steel was still made by those who had a feel for it. There was nowhere one could just go read up on steel making and handling. You had to just go do it. As a result, there were only a few areas in the world that had perfected steel and were revered as makers. Even in the 19th century, Damascus in present-day Syria was renowned. That area, all the way to the Mediterranean, used to be famous for its fragrant cedars. These, over thousands of years, were sacrificed to iron furnaces. Spanish steel, particularly from Toledo, was also well known, to the point that Toledo, Ohio, became a bit of a steel manufacturing center, more or less on its name alone. Japan carefully meted out its sword steel, and the British manufacturing city of Sheffield cornered the early industrial steel market. Along with knowledge, the other reason steel manufacture didn't spread was that pounding the wrought iron to steel by hand or even with water-driven hammers is a lot of work. So while steel is much more common in the early 19th century than it was in the centuries leading up to it, it was still pretty rare. Steel is also a giant, huge pain to work with in shaping. Iron on its own has a lower melting point, and the cast iron and the wrought iron with their higher amounts of impurities can be brought to workable temperatures quite a bit cooler before steel can. For this reason, steel is hard to work, and it is even harder to get two pieces of steel to join together. But on the other hand, it's also hard to get a big chunk of wrought iron worked out into steel. So as a result, in the 19th century, there really are only a few things that are commonly made out of steel. But the things that are depend on that bouncy quality and the way it holds its shape so well, which means it also holds a sharp edge very well. So when steel was rare, there were a few things that were commonly made of steel. Steel armor was prized. So were swords, knives, and saw blades, which meant that broken saw blades were a prized piece of scrap steel that blacksmiths liked to work with. I mean, after all, 90% of the toil in making the steel item was done. And so, a number of early American steel implements are actually made from broken saw blades imported, often from England. This included knives, early manufacturing pieces in experimental machines, and the plow. Now, John Deere gets all the fanfare for bringing the steel plow to America and then the world. But the deeper truth seems to be that he was just the best at making the idea big. Several people had recognized that a better plow had to be built, and the pointy bit of the plowshare needed to be out of steel. But getting broken saw blades to come together and work as a plow blade, that was a design challenge. And so it seems to fall to one John Lane of Homer Township on the Illinois prairie, who was already an experienced blacksmith, to figure this out. After much tinkering, somewhere around 1835, he was able to combine thin strips of steel that he had cut from a broken saw blade with softer iron as a backing to make the desired shape. And the plow was a success. It sloughed off the sticky prairie soil and was able to cut through a variety of roots. But each one of these new plows had to be made to order, by hand. They were expensive and slow to produce. There was no good source of plate steel in America at this time. All the same, besides meeting local demand, Lane was able to produce 200 plows to send out to the growing post-gold rush community in California in 1854. Emphasizing how poor cross-continent travel was at that age, he sent them from Illinois to California via Cape Horn. That means he put them on a barge that went down the Illinois River to the Mississippi and then down to New Orleans. From there, these plowshares were boarded on a ship, and they went east out around the east side of South America, down to within waving distance of Antarctica, around Cape Horn, and then back up the west side next to Chile, and were probably unloaded in San Francisco. So this means Lane could turn out an order of plows for sale. But for the most part, the tradition had been that a farmer would come in, order a plow, and then wait. John Deere, on the other hand, while he was a competent enough blacksmith, he also seems to have been a bit of a promoter. He saw the increasingly large waves of people, frustrated Americans and bedraggled immigrants, spreading out into the prairie, and they wanted to get a start as soon as they could. So he started making steel plows more or less on speculation, and he was able to work with other engineers and financiers to build a water-powered manufacturing facility that he occupied for about 6 years. From there, he moved to Moline, Illinois, where he would have access to not just the Mississippi River, but to the other major American steel consumer, the railroad. It's a bit mind-boggling to realize that Lane's steel plows took the boat and several months to get to California in 1854, but just 15 years later, in 1869, the Golden Spike, completing the first coast-to-coast stretch of railway track, was pounded in, changing that trip from a chancy, multi-month or year trek involving all manner of hardships to something that could be accomplished in less than 2 weeks. The steel plow that turned sod busting from something that was nearly impossible into just a very hard task meant the prairies were no longer seen as a desert. They were a field, and the steel tendrils reaching from the sea to the plains meant there was a way to start growing piles of grain and herds of cattle out there where there was plenty of space and water. And with the railway, there was a feasible, possible way developing to get all that food back to the mills and population centers along the rivers and coasts on the other side of the Appalachian Mountain Barrier. So here we are in the period of 1800 to 1861. We are not at industrial America yet, but the groundwork is being laid. The problem of the prairie is solved by figuring out how to get steel onto a plow. The voracious demand of pioneers and immigrants for land and the tools to work it are being met by the policies of the U.S. government and people like John Deere, who see that some products can be built out ahead of the demand for them. In fact, demand can even be created. And this ridiculously large landmass was being tied together by waterways. There are quite a few useful rivers heading out to the Atlantic, and then there's the Mississippi, which is navigable from Minnesota to New Orleans. tying the new parts of the country together. And when there's no cooperative waterway, canals are being built. The most famous, the Erie Canal, was completed in 1825, and this tied the whole Great Lakes basin to the busy Atlantic port of New York. But waterways have their downsides, their floods, their low water periods, there's rocks, there's tree snag hazards, and well, boats are boats. They're slow, and they're really limited to where they can go in the end. The future was overland, and so the railroad is coming, one steel rail at a time. And at this point, steel really was the choke point. It took time to cut down trees, to make charcoal, and to make iron, and then steel in batches. But two other things were emerging. Figuring out how to make coal a suitable fuel source to make steel. It was already charcoal, just a much more concentrated form. And then the Bessemer process was in development. It would be patented in 1856, but it had been in development in fits and starts for over a decade. The Bessemer process is a way to more efficiently and more predictably combine the right ingredients in the right proportions at the right temperatures to make steel. And it made steel of a predictable standard in ways that had been impossible. And this would all firmly make metallurgy a science and sideline the aspects that were an art. But all of these parts aren't quite talking yet. But after the Civil War, they will be. Solving the riddle of the prairie soil, finding a key to the problem of overland travel, and figuring out how to supply both of these innovations with steel is going to change American food, American eating habits, and the world as well in just a few decades. But for now, here in the first half of the century, it means that more people are going to spread out across the continent. American food, after all, being more or less smooshed together between the Atlantic Ocean and the Appalachians, is going to burst out all over the continent. The extremely English outlook with French decorations is going to go through a number of changes and obtain a wild number of additions. Views of what is savage and what is civilized is also going to undergo a few changes. Community cookery is going to change, especially who your community is. This great spreading out is going to put the American cook more on her own than at any time since those first pilgrims got here. And possibly she's actually even more on her own now. The attitude towards wild game is going to shift again, but ideas about foraging wild plants is going to remain about the same. But America's love for wheat bread, that will only grow. We are going to grow so much wheat that even the poor can give up their cornbread some days. We'll still grow corn, and lots of it, and barley will soon become even more plentiful. Rice will continue, but as a fancy crop for fancy people. But with the move into the prairie, and steel plows becoming practical, from this point forward, America will run on bread and steel. And for both of those, the important word will be more. If you're feeling like some steely bread, run down a heritage wheat flour and some slow-rise yeast. A good place is the leftover yeast goo or barm from someone who's homebrewing, and let that grow for the 8 to 18 hours it needs. If you don't have time for that, regular flour and a fast rise yeast is just fine. And if you're looking for a nice, easy bread, make a focaccia and revel in the pretty quick, darn tasty, modern fresh bread. The King Arthur recipe online is very cooperative. Next time, I'm sticking with wheat because it's time to delve into the mystery of crackers. They've been with us since at least the end of the 18th century. I mean, they're mentioned in our very first cookbook. But why are they crackers here and biscuits just about everywhere else? And what the heck is a Cracker Barrel? And why did they go away? I'll get into all of that. Thanks for listening. There's really only one way this podcast grows, I've discovered, and that is by word of mouth. So don't be afraid to share this with any of your food fan or history curious friends. Any email questions or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. And as always, I love hearing what you have to say in your reviews. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Blue Sky, and Instagram as THOA food. And all this information is available in the show description.